So take a few more minutes to check your motivation. And you already did generate a really positive, altruistic motivation earlier today. So bring that to mind, refresh it, renew it as your reason for being here, participating in this session. One of the methods we looked at yesterday for transforming problems into the spiritual path is using a problem to generate compassion, increase our compassion. So let's try that out. Bring to mind a problem, a painful experience, something you're unhappy about that is be present in your life right now. It doesn't have to be your biggest problem. Might be best to start with something smaller. And it could be something physical. For example, maybe feeling hungry because you didn't have breakfast, or some other discomfort in your body. Or it could be something you're unhappy about, something more on the emotional level. So just choose one problem, a relatively small one, and bring that to mind. And as you do this, notice if there's aversion. There's a feeling of aversion. I don't want this. I don't like this. I want to get rid of it. And if you do notice aversion, check if that's helpful. Does it help to have aversion, or does it make things worse? And reflect that you do have a choice what you do with your mind. You can choose to go with the aversion, get stuck in that, feed it, but you can also choose to do something else with this problem, this experience. And as we saw yesterday, we can even transform problems into the path. Although what we're transforming isn't necessarily the problem itself or the situation itself, but rather our mind, the way we think about it, the attitudes we have, the way we view it. So, one way of doing this is to use a problem to generate compassion. And so we can think about other people. Just understand you're not the only person in the world that has this kind of problem. You could think of people you yourself know who have a problem like the one you have. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but similar. You could also think of other people in your community, in this country, internationally, others who have the same or a similar problem. And maybe you can think of some people who have this kind of problem, but even worse than what you're experiencing. But when thinking about others who are suffering, don't let your mind go down the road of despair, overwhelm, hopelessness. That's not helpful. Instead, generate compassion. Because you yourself have this experience, you know what it's like, you know how unpleasant it is. So that puts you in a position where you can understand how those other people feel. They're basically just like you. They don't want this problem. It's unpleasant for them, painful for them. And so to transform this awareness into compassion, you can use your own words, but something like, how wonderful it would be if everyone could be free of this suffering, this problem. So see if you can generate that state of mind of really wishing all people and all beings to be free of this problem, this suffering. And you could also think of ways that you could help at least some people to be free of this problem. For example, you might reach out to someone you know who has this kind of problem and give them an opportunity to talk about it, give them some support, make donations to organizations that help relieve this kind of problem. So we can't expect ourselves to eliminate this problem, this suffering for everyone in the world, in the universe. But there are some things we can do to make a contribution to the relief of this suffering. So think of some ways you can do that and make the decision to put your energy into that. And you could also make the determination to work on yourself, work on your mind, so that you can be better able to deal with a problem like this, so that then you can be more helpful to others who experience it. Oh, that's what's happening.
I can lower it or turn it off.
I mean, it feels kind of nice, but maybe if it's lower, yeah, a little bit lower would be helpful. Yeah, it's going to be hot today, I think. So, yeah, for me personally, that's one of my favorite go-to methods when I'm. I think it just went up. um, yeah. I mean, I love compassion. I need more compassion, and if you value compassion and you really want to develop more compassion, then I think it's easy to see the connection when we're going through some kind of problem or difficulty ourselves. That here's an opportunity to increase my compassion. So in that way, you can get some idea about how bodhisattvas can, even feel happy when they have problems, because they know, oh, this is a great opportunity to increase my compassion and, benefit others. So, yeah, so another method, I mentioned this yesterday, but we didn't have time to go into it, is the practice of tonglen, or taking and giving. And this is related to compassion. So I'm sure many of you have heard of it before, but those who haven't, again, Pema Chodron kind of made it famous, talks about it a lot in her books. So Tonglen is a Tibetan term, and it means giving and taking. Although it's probably better to turn that around and taking and giving. So the idea is you generate compassion for the suffering of others, and then you increase your compassion and generate courage such that you wish to take their suffering away. You know, you're not just wishing them to be free of suffering, but you feeling, I want to take their suffering. I would like to take their suffering on myself and experience it so they don't have to experience it. It's a really powerful feeling of compassion. And I think, it's something that people do sometimes experience naturally. For example, parents. I'm sure I'm not a parent myself, but if you're a mother or a father and you see your child suffering, that must be so unbearable. You don't want your child to suffer. You want them to be happy. And you might have that wish, oh, if only I could have that suffering instead of them so they don't have to suffer. Yeah? So maybe some of you have felt that with your children. Yeah? If it were possible, I would take that on myself and experience it so they don't have to. Yeah, so people sometimes just feel that way naturally, spontaneously. It comes from love. You really love that person, that being, and compassion. You don't want them to suffer. You want them to be happy and free of suffering. And your love and compassion are so strong that you would even wish to take that suffering onto yourself. So that is the idea here, and that's what bodhisattvas cultivate. They cultivate that feeling towards everyone gradually, of course. You start small, but you build up, and gradually they get to the point where they really feel this way, that they wish to take the suffering of others and give them their happiness. So the giving part of the practice is based on love, loving kindness, where you want others to be happy and are willing to give your own happiness to them. So again, that's something people sometimes feel naturally, especially parents, right? If there's a limited amount of food to eat, then they would happily go without so that their children are full, right? Go hungry so your kids, have something to eat. So, so these attitudes are like totally opposite to self-centeredness. Our self-centered attitude is usually me, me, me. I want to be happy and I don't care about others. I don't want to suffer. I don't care about others. So that's our instinctive, intuitive, self-centered attitude, selfish attitude. And on the Bodhisattva path, that's one of the main obstacles, one of the things that needs to be reduced and eventually overcome. So that's actually where this practice comes from. It comes in the context of recognizing that self-centeredness, that habitual attitude we have, is a huge hindrance on the path. It's impossible to become a Buddha and be selfish. There's no such thing as a selfish Buddha. So, yeah, so that's something we have to overcome, but it's not easy because it's so habitual. It's so ingrained in us. So seeing, the disadvantages of that attitude, the self-centered attitude, and then the opposite attitude is altruism, being more concerned for others than oneself. So seeing that is a very valuable, precious attitude and something we have to develop if we want to progress on the Bodhisattva path. So there's meditations that you do where you sort of compare those two attitudes. Selfishness on one hand and altruism on the other. And you think, which one is better? You use reasons, you use experiences to hopefully become convinced that, altruism is much better. It's better for me and also better for everybody. and for my ultimate goal of enlightenment. And so you really become convinced that you want to change your way of doing things and become less self-centered and more altruistic. And and this practice of Tonglen is a method for doing that, for reducing self-centeredness and increasing altruism. And so the traditional way that it's taught in like the Lojong teachings is it's best to start small. Sometimes they explain it like all sentient beings. Think about all living beings in the universe and their suffering, and then wish to take it all on. That's kind of hard to do right from the beginning. So it's better to start small, like one person. Think of one person, and somebody you know. It's probably easier to use someone you know and you already care about. Yeah, you want them to be happy. You don't want them to suffer. So you could bring to mind someone you know who's got a problem, and then, think about their problem and really generate that wish for them to be free of their problem, free of their suffering. How wonderful that would be. And so you build up that feeling of compassion and feel, I would like to take it away from them. I would like to take that problem onto myself so that they don't have to experience it. To generate that state of mind. And then you can use visualization. That's the way it's usually explained. You think of the suffering or the problem of the other person in the form of like smoke or fog or pollution, and imagine it coming from them in that form into yourself. And then you imagine your self-centered attitude here in your heart chakra is some kind of dark lump, or something kind of whatever, something that's kind of an obstacle. You can see it as an obstacle. And so then you imagine this problem of the other person coming into you. You can do it with the breath as you're breathing in, or you can just have it come however you want. And then it becomes like something like a bolt of lightning, and it strikes this lump of self-centeredness in your heart and just obliterates it, makes it non-existent. And then within that spaciousness that's left once the self-centered attitude is gone, then you can think of all your good qualities, your happiness, your resources, your good karma, and so on, and all the good stuff you have. And you can imagine that as something beautiful, like a light or a jewel. And then you generate love for the other person. You want them to be happy. You want them to have all the good things. And then you imagine sending that energy from your heart to them. And it goes into them, and you can imagine them being filled up and having what they need. So that's just the rough idea of the practice. It's taking and giving, taking on the suffering of the other person, using it to obliterate your self-centered attitude, and then giving your happiness to the other person, and imagining that they receive that and are happy. So that's the basic idea. And it's good to start small, and then gradually, with more experience, more practice, you can bring in more and more people, beings, and eventually get to the point where you can do this with everybody. Some people love this practice. They take to it like a duck to water. Maybe past life experience or whatever. Other people feel scared. Other people feel, I got enough problems as it is. I don't want any more. I can't take on any more. So they say if you're like that, if you feel kind of scared and unable to take on any more suffering or problems, then they say you can start with your own problems. Yeah, start by learning to take on your own suffering, and then as you get more used to that, you can start doing it with others. And so the way they use, well, one way of taking on your own suffering is to meditate on problems that you will probably experience in the future as you get older and so on. So problems of aging, problems of sickness, problems of loss. You kind of imagine the things that you will be experiencing in the future, difficulties that you will have. And then you imagine taking those on. I think you could probably still do the same visualization. Maybe you could visualize your future self. Think of your future self and the sufferings, the problems that person will experience. And then, imagine taking them on, using them to overcome your self-centered attitude, and then giving happiness, resources, good energy to your future self. So that's a gradual approach, starting to develop courage with regard to sufferings, problems you yourself will experience in the future, and then gradually move on to others, starting with someone you already know and love and care about, and then working from there. And I've also learned a way of doing this practice with regard to a problem that's happening in the present. I can't remember the source of this, but I do think it's a valid practice, and it's also very effective. So, for example, whatever it was we thought of during the last meditation, a present problem, a present difficulty, like hunger, for example. um, so um, you can start the meditation in the same way we did just now. Just think, okay, right now there's this experience which is unpleasant. I don't like it. I don't want it. But then I'm not the only person in the world who is experiencing a problem like this. Lots of other people. And then you, just as we did in the meditation we just did, think about others who have a similar problem, generate compassion for them, and then you say to yourself something like, I will accept this problem that I'm experiencing. I will take it on. I will bear it. By my doing that, may all those other people be free of their suffering, their problem. It's kind of like you're voluntarily accepting this present experience that you have instead of rejecting it, disliking it, wanting to push it away, wanting to get rid of it. So you're turning that around and saying, okay, I'm accepting it, I'm experiencing it. And by my doing that, may all the other people who have a problem like this, may they be free of it. May they be relieved. Another version of that is just to think, may the suffering of other people's problem that's like this, may all of that be absorbed into the one that I'm experiencing. And by my experiencing it, may they be free, may they be relieved. So, yeah, I don't always do it, but I do it sometimes, and I find it really effective because you're changing your attitude about this present problem instead of the aversion, the rejection. I don't want this. I don't like this, which just makes things worse. So you're turning that around, and it's like making this problem into something meaningful, something beneficial, rather than garbage, something you want to throw away. Yeah, and and I mean, for me, when I do it, it's like the problem. It's not a problem anymore. It becomes something kind of useful, something valuable. So your attitude towards it changes, and yeah, you feel better. And your compassion, it increases your compassion, grows your compassion. And sometimes the problem may even disappear by itself. It's like it's no longer there. I remember that happened once with a headache. I had a really bad headache, and I was, you know, I did take some Tylenol or something, but it didn't work. So then I did this, and yeah, then the headache went away. Maybe the Tylenol kicked in, but at least, but at least, my attitude changed. I didn't feel so miserable. I felt happier. Yeah. And doing this kind of practice doesn't mean we shouldn't take Tylenol. That we shouldn't try to find a solution to our problem. We can. If you break your leg, you shouldn't just lie there with a broken leg and do Tonglen practice. It's fine to go to the hospital, get the treatment you need. But, there'll probably still be some suffering there, some physical suffering, some mental suffering. So you can still do this practice with whatever, problems you're having. And it turns it into something meaningful, something valuable, something that's part of your spiritual practice instead of an obstacle. Oh, this is bad. I don't want this, Yeah, so there's different ways of doing Tonglen practice. Some very brief, some very extensive. And you don't even have to be like in a meditative situation to do. I read there was some woman who was doing, I think she was actually doing some research into Tonglen practice, but she was also practicing it. And she said she would use it at work when there were meetings, like business meetings, which could sometimes become kind of not very pleasant. And so she'd be sitting there imagining that whatever negative energy there was, unhappiness, anger, whatever, she would imagine that, taking it in with her breathing and then sending out positive energy. And it seems that it had an effect. Meetings would become better. Yeah, the meetings would be nicer. And even some of her colleagues noticed that, because she said one time she passed a couple of colleagues in the hallway and they were going to a meeting, and they asked her if she was going, and they said, yeah, meetings go better when you're there. Something like that. So yeah, so it can actually have an effect on other people and on situations. But the question people often ask is, if you do this practice, do you actually take away the suffering of others? Yeah, and then they're free of that suffering and you have it? They say no. In the tradition, in the teachings, they say no, it doesn't work like that because of karma. Each of us is responsible for our own karma. So we are the ones who create the karma. We are the ones who experience the results of that karma. So if somebody is going through some kind of suffering, some kind of problem, that's the result of karma they have created. And it isn't possible for anyone else to take away the karma of somebody. Even a Buddha can't do that. Because if it was possible, the Buddha would take away everybody's bad karma and nobody would have any more suffering. That's clearly not happening. So yeah, even a Buddha isn't able to extract bad karma from someone and extract suffering from them. So it's all happening within our own mind. Our mind is the creator of our own experiences and is the one who experiences the results of those experiences. So yeah, I didn't mean to say that. Our mind is the creator of our actions, which are the cause of our experiences, and we ourselves are the experiencer of the results of our actions. So it isn't possible to exchange karma, give away some of your karma, take away somebody else's karma. It doesn't work like that. So they say generally, yeah, we can't really take away another person's suffering, although they do tell some stories. They say sometimes if there's a really strong karmic connection between one person and another, it might happen that, the suffering you're wanting to take on will actually do that. They tell a story of some lama who was, I think somebody, hit a dog, was beating a dog, and the lama, was very compassionate and wanted to take the suffering of the dog. And he actually had a bruise on his body where the dog had been hit. So it can happen, but I think that's rare. And so, yeah, it isn't the case that we will actually take we'll experience what we are taking on from somebody else. If you're taking on somebody's cancer, for example, it doesn't mean you're going to get cancer. So in that way, that might give us a little more courage to do the practice. Yeah, otherwise, yeah, taking on all the suffering of all the beings in the universe. Oh, I can't manage that. That's too much for me. On the other hand, the lamas say that, yeah, if you're really following the bodhisattva's path, then you do need to develop that kind of courage. Yeah, the willingness to take on the suffering of others, similar to what parents feel with their child. They have this tremendous courage, willingness, because of love and compassion for their child, then they're willing to take on problems and difficulties so the child doesn't have to have them. Maybe in one of the later meditation sessions, this practice could be done as a group. Is there another meditation before lunch today? Or yeah, okay, maybe. Okay, one other method that we can use when having problems is to contemplate emptiness, selflessness. This is kind of the ultimate solution to problems, although it's not easy to practice, because ideally we need to have heard teachings about emptiness, not just once or twice, but again and again and again, because it's a very difficult topic to understand, even intellectually, and it's complex, so it takes time to understand it. So it's advised that we study and we discuss with teachers and fellow students, work out whatever confusions we have, whatever doubts and questions we have. But even just doing a little bit of investigation into this topic is already very, very helpful, and starts to break down the wrong views, the wrong conceptions that we have about things. So in general, contemplating emptiness or selflessness means we are investigating how things exist. How do things exist? Do they exist the way that I see them, or is the way that I see them wrong, incorrect? So we usually don't doubt. Probably most people don't have doubt that the way things appear to them is how they exist. We usually just believe, yeah, things exist the way I see them. I see reality. So the Buddha asked us to question that, to investigate that. And we did a little bit of that already with impermanence, looking at impermanence. Um, so we do tend to see things as if they are not changing, as if they stay the same, unmoving, unchanging. But if we think about that more carefully, then we can see that, yeah, that's not the case. Things do change. And so with emptiness or selflessness, this is kind of going deeper. Um, and there's different schools of thought within Buddhism about this topic, how things do exist and what is the mistaken way that we see things. And in our tradition, we follow one school of thought called the Madhyamaka Prasangika, or in English that means the middle way consequentialist. Kind of complicated. Um, uh, it was taught by the Buddha, but further explained by some Indian masters like Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, and probably most Tibetan masters, Lama Tsongkhapa, Atisha, and so on, also follow this school and explain things in that way. So according to that school, they say that all things, whatever exists, ourself, others, our bodies, our minds, all the things in the world around us, as well as all the experiences that we have and all the things that happen, all the happenings. So everything. And also both on the level of samsara, where we're at, as well as on the level of nirvana, enlightenment, higher levels. So everything, everywhere, has this the same nature, which is said to be empty of inherent existence. So that's the meaning of emptiness. And emptiness is the true nature of things, and emptiness means things are empty of inherent existence. Now, inherent existence is probably a term we don't use in our everyday vocabulary. When you go to the supermarket, you don't ask people, do you think things are inherently existent? But it's a term used in this type of tradition. And I struggled for a long time. What does that mean? And there's other synonyms of inherent existence, like true existence, objective existence, substantial existence. There's a whole list of different synonyms, but they're probably equally like, what? But the one term that I found most helpful is independent existence, existing independently. So what it really means, what all these terms mean is it's a mode of existence, a way of existing, where things seem to be independent. They seem to exist on their own, not depending on anything else. Kind of standalone, autonomous, separate, cut off from everything else. So they say this is how we see things. This is how things appear to us because of ignorance. It's not our choice, but because we have ignorance in our mind from forever, and we're even born with it. So we already come into this world seeing things that way. So things appear as if they exist independently, meaning they don't depend on anything else for their existence. And this is a false mode of existence. Nothing exists that way. There's actually nothing in the universe that is like that can stand on its own, totally separate, totally cut off, totally independent of everything else. But we have to investigate this. We have to check this for ourselves. And we're given some clues how to do this. So, yeah, according to this school of philosophy, they say whatever exists depends on other things. And there's three main ways that things are dependent. One is on causes and conditions, and that's fairly easy to understand. That doesn't take too much, understanding. So our bodies, for example, our bodies didn't always exist, but came into existence depending on our parents, specifically on parts of their bodies, the sperm, the egg that came together, turned into a zygote, and then started to multiply. Cells started to multiply, and it turned into a fetus, and then a baby, and then came out and drank a lot of milk, ate a lot of food, and grew up, became like this. So, yeah, our body came about as a result of those causes and conditions. Without those causes and conditions, this body wouldn't be here. So that's not too difficult to understand, but it's probably something we don't normally think about. I mean, we don't remember, most people don't remember, going through that process. Our memories start maybe when we're a couple of years old, but we don't remember anything before that. But we know. This is where bodies come from. And the same with all other material things. Yeah, every human-made thing, like buildings, clothes, food, computers, cars, so all the things, made by people, depend on causes and conditions. Materials, raw materials, and then machinery, and then people working and, producing those things. Okay, so those are causes and conditions. So that's not too difficult to understand. And meditating on that, contemplating that, does help. It does give us a different sense of things instead of seeing things, because normally we see a body and it can seem as if that person always existed that way. That body always existed that way. We don't normally think of, the tiny zygote, growing, becoming a baby, and so on and so on. If we did, we'd probably feel differently. I know for myself, I find this really helpful. If there's somebody I'm angry at, somebody I don't like, I find it really helpful to think of that process of that body coming into existence. First, it wasn't there at all. And then the zygote came and da-da-da-da-da. And it's also helpful to think of that person as a little baby, because, we don't usually hate babies, right? It's hard to feel hatred for a baby. So if you think of that person as a little baby, really cute, crying, helpless, it sort of softens your heart, softens your mind. Yeah? Kind of helps to melt the aversion, the dislike you might feel. So not only do things depend on causes and conditions to begin with, to come into existence, but they also, to continue existing, they need causes and conditions. So we need food, we need water, we need air, we need the right temperature to go on existing. If those causes and conditions aren't there, then our body will die, won't be able to continue as a body. So I'm just talking about this in a brief way, but it's something very helpful to contemplate how things depend on causes and conditions. It's Lama Yeshe used the term concrete view to talk about the way we normally see things. We normally see things as if they're sort of concrete, solid, not literally like the stuff they put on the ground, but concrete in the sense of very solid and unmoving and unchanging, as if they've always been that way, they always will be that way. And when we have that view of things, we see things in a concrete way, it feeds our afflictions. So if we dislike somebody, we're angry at somebody, and seeing that person in a very concrete way, they've always been bad, they always will be bad, and I'll never be able to like them and get along with them. Yeah, everything seems very concrete and solid. And but doing this kind of contemplation, thinking about how that person came into existence from causes and conditions, also whatever behavior, yeah, their behavior or their attitudes that we don't like, that we object to, that we find really irritating, those are also dependent on causes and conditions. A person probably wasn't like that when they were a baby. They may have had the seeds, seeds in their mind to become like that, but then those seeds were watered by, probably parents and other people influencing them, their education, and so on and so forth. So there were causes and conditions that um, nourished their basic seeds of qualities and led them to become the way they did. And yeah, so thinking about the causes and conditions for the behavior, the attitudes, the actions of that person that you don't like, that can also help to soften. Lamiashi would say this: the concrete view gets softer instead of being so concrete, becomes more like liquid, softer, and then that really helps your mind, your attitudes, to not feel so angry or hateful, or yeah. And there's more room, more space in your mind to have more positive feelings like compassion, forgiveness, patience, and so on. And then, so that's one way that things are dependent, causes and conditions. And then a second way that things are dependent is parts. Everything has parts, everything is made of parts. And so thinking about that will also help to soften the concrete view. So you can again think of a person and the parts that make them up. They have, many parts of their body: skin, blood, bones, organs, cells, molecules, atoms. So you can just think about that. And again, the person doesn't seem so solid. And yeah, so everything has parts. And if those parts weren't there, if the parts were taken away, then that object wouldn't exist anymore. That's not so difficult to understand. But it's something we don't normally think about. We don't normally see things as if they had parts. We tend to see things as if they were whole and solid and partless. And again, that view of things kind of feeds, nourishes our afflictions, whether it's anger and hatred or attachment, desire, craving. I want that. But when you kind of mentally take it apart and think about the parts and ask yourself, well, yeah, which part am I attracted to? Which part is so wonderful and fantastic? It softens the view. And then the third way that things are dependent is, this is more difficult to understand, and I don't fully understand myself. But it relates to our mind, and the way it's explained is that things are dependent on being labeled or imputed or designated by our mind. So if we take, um, for example, a computer. Okay, so computer is made of parts, lots of different parts. And so when we see a computer, especially if it's my computer, my precious, wonderful, fantastic computer that I use so much every day and depend on, so it's my computer. So it appears as if, my computer is something real and almost kind of solid and concrete from its own side, like there's a real computer there. But if if there really was a real computer there, existing independently on its own, we should be able to find it. We should be able to point to something and say, that is it. That is the computer. And if we've already thought about how it's made of parts, all the different pieces of metal and plastic, and inside all the different, I don't even know the words for them, components of a computer. There's many, many, many different parts, and we could even break it down further into the molecules, the atoms, so all of these different parts that make up the computer. So can we point to any of those parts and say that is the computer? Like, where is the actual computer? Somebody might say, well, it's right here. It's right here. But what you're pointing to is just one part of the computer. Probably the cover, the surface. What do you call this? The case of the computer. And you're pointing to just one part of that case. So is that what you're pointing to? Is that the computer? If it was, then you could have just that and leave the rest, and you'd still have a computer. So obviously that's not the case. So it's true, any part you point to is just a part of a computer and not a computer. No, part of a computer isn't a computer. So then where is the computer? Well, we would say, well, it's the whole thing, the whole collection of parts, all the parts put together. That's the computer. So this is what the Buddhist masters in India and Tibet did. They would use logic, reasoning logic, to break down these concepts that we have. So what they say is, okay, so if you go through the parts of the computer and you realize none of the parts is a computer, there's no individual part that is a computer. So that means all the parts are non-computers. They are not computers. Okay? That makes sense? I mean, we don't normally talk like that, but anyway, it's a non-computer. So this key is a non-computer, and the case is a non-computer, and the screen is a non-computer, because by itself, it's not a computer. So therefore, it's a non-computer. So if you try to say, well, the collection of all the parts is a computer, then what you're saying is you can put together a whole bunch of non-computers, and that makes a computer. But if you can't find a computer in any of the parts, then how is it possible that all the parts together can be a computer? What Chandrakirti says is, if that was the case, if a collection of parts of a computer was a computer, then you could have a pile of parts over here, just like take all the parts apart and just pile them up over here and say that's a computer. He does this with a chariot. He uses a chariot. That's what they used in those days, wheels and all those things. So you could put all the parts of the chariot over here, and it would be a chariot, and you could get in and travel somewhere. So in the same way, if we say the collection of parts of the computer is a computer, then we could have just a pile of computer parts here, and it would function as a computer. But obviously that's not going to work. So yeah, the point is we're trying to look for a computer that's like the way it appears to us, a real, solid, independently existing, intrinsically existing computer. And when we go through this kind of process, then it becomes very difficult to find that. And in fact, if we really do this well, do this properly, we won't find it. What we will find is the emptiness the emptiness of a real, solid, independently existing computer. That doesn't mean we're denying the existence of the computer. We're not saying there's no computer at all. There is a computer, but it's not an independently existing computer. It's a dependently existing computer. It's a computer that exists by putting together a number of parts. They have to be the right parts, and they have to be put together in the right way, of course. And then it's just labeled. It's just named, imputed, designated computer. We give the name computer to this collection of things, none of which is a computer. We put together a bunch of non-computers and we call it a computer. But to try to find a computer as a real, solid, independently existing thing, that doesn't work. It's not findable. So I'm just briefly talking about this. Maybe at some point, maybe tomorrow morning, we can do a meditation on it. But how this relates to problems, if we get some understanding of this process, we can apply it to problems, to what we call a problem. Does a problem exist inherently, independently, intrinsically as a problem? Something undesirable, something that makes us unhappy. That's how it seems, right? When we have a problem. Yeah, it seems like, oh, this is so bad. This is such a huge problem, and I can't help but feel unhappy and miserable and so on about it. That's how it seems. And because it appears that way, we buy into that appearance, that again sort of feeds our emotions of being unhappy and having aversion and so forth. And so we don't have to go through that whole thing I just explained, but a simpler way would be to just check if this situation that I'm calling a problem, if it really was a problem independently, inherently from its own side, then everyone would see it that way. Everyone else would see it as a problem too, because that's how it is. It's like it's screaming to us, I am a problem, and everyone should see it that way too. So we can check that. Does everyone see that situation the same way that we do? If we take a simple example, food. I probably shouldn't talk about food. Maybe it'll just make you feel more hungry, but you might be thinking about food anyway, so useful example. So, different people like different kinds of food. So let's say there's a certain type of food, and for some people that food is delicious. They love it. They think it's wonderful. They're happy to eat it. But not everybody feels that way. That same type of food for some people is like, oh no, I don't like that. Oh, yuck. Okay. And so that's a clear example. If that type of food was inherently, independently wonderful and delicious, everybody would like it. Everybody would experience it that way because that's its nature. Its intrinsic quality is to be delicious. So it would be delicious for everybody. But it's never like that. For example, durians. If you've been to Asia, Southeast Asia, there's this kind of fruit called a durian. Huge, it looks weird on the outside. It's got all these spikes and it smells yuck. But people love it. Some people, yeah, native. Yeah, who likes durian? Who doesn't like durian? Okay, so that's a good example. I mean, some people just go crazy about durian. Anyway, so for me, it's not delicious. Some people see it as delicious, they love it. Other people see it as unpleasant and can't stand it, even to smell it. Um, yeah, so if durian was inherently delicious or inherently horrible, then everybody would experience it in one of those two ways, but clearly it's not. So that's like an example of how it's really our mind that gives that label or designation, delicious or horrible or whatever. But it's not the object itself that exists that way. It depends on the mind. It also depends on a lot of other factors, like why some people find it delicious, other people don't. That's other factors. But the point is, the object itself from its own side is neither this or that, neither good nor bad. So we can apply that then to something we consider a problem, a certain situation that we consider a problem, like noise. I use that one because I'm very sensitive to noise, and probably most people are. Um, so certain sounds, for example, a loud ticking clock. How many people have trouble with that? How many people have no problem with it? Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So if a ticking clock really was inherently disturbing, everybody would be disturbed by it. Everybody would have a problem. It would be a problem for everybody, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's something we can use when we're having a problem with someone or something, is to ask ourselves, is this really problematic from its own side, such that I can't help but be unhappy about it, be disturbed about it? Or does it have something to do with my mind? How my mind is working and thinking and labeling it, imputing it, designating it. This is harder. Some of the other techniques might work easier for you, but this can be very helpful. And I still haven't realized emptiness. I'm far from that. But just doing this exercise, I find helpful. And what I do sometimes is I'll switch my way of looking at something that I find disturbing or problematic, and that makes it easier to manage. For example, one time I was living in a place where a neighbor was a musician, a composer, musical composer, and all day long he'd be making music. And it was actually pleasant music. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was the same thing over, and he was working on this composition, so he was playing the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And I found it really hard, and I didn't feel that I could knock on his door and say, stop. I mean, that was his livelihood. He was also my landlord, so I wanted to, stay on good terms. And so I worked with my mind, and and I thought, well, this is where the problem is. It's not out there. Other people would be really happy hearing this music, but it's my mind. So when what I did with my mind was I thought, now if this was my brother, one of my brothers likes to play music and is a composer as well, and I love my brother, and so I thought, if he was my brother, I would feel very differently, because he's family, I love him, and I can put up with what he does, and he's always kind to me and helped me and da 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 da. And so I just said to myself, this is my brother. It's my brother playing this music. And it changed. It really made a huge difference. Yeah. I mean, it's not that I disliked that man. It just didn't have a strong connection with him. But when I imagined him as my brother, And he has been in past lives. He's been my brother and my mother and my father and all kinds of things. So just changing that kind of label or designation really made a difference. And I wasn't bothered by that music anymore. Well, most of the time. But whenever it did, whenever the irritation kicked in, then I would do that. So, yeah, that's just one way that I found helpful in using this idea of emptiness, that things aren't inherently, intrinsically, independently good or bad, problematic or pleasing, but it depends on our minds and how our minds are viewing things and labeling, designating things. And if we change the label, the designation, then that can change our way of relating to them. Also in Tantra, in the practice of Tantra, when you're doing that practice, one of the things we're supposed to do, I don't know if that's been mentioned here, but when you're really doing a practice like White Tara, whatever sounds you hear, you imagine are the sound of the mantra, Tara's mantra, or whatever mantra you're working with. You think whatever all sounds are the sounds of the mantra. So the turkey is gobbling, it's the mantra. The birds making noise, it's the mantra. Cars going by, it's the mantra. So that way you're, not only are you familiarizing yourself with that mantra, but you're transforming whatever appears to you. So nothing becomes irritating. Also, nothing is cause of desire or attachment coming up. So it's a good way to overcome afflictions. So that's, yeah, I'm just planting seeds that this is another way of working with problems. I did want to leave some time for questions. And yeah, we still have. Oh yeah. So while I remember, I have asked Shiva to give the talk this afternoon because we were talking the other day about his work with climate psychology. Is that what you call it? Climate Psychology Alliance. Because when we were talking about grief the other day and different kinds of grief, Mary Grace mentioned, what did you call it? Climate grief. Yeah, climate grief. That was a new term for me. I hadn't heard that before, but it makes sense. So I guess, yeah, a lot of people, especially young people, are experiencing this with regard to what's happening in the world and what kind of future they're, they're looking forward to. So I thought it would be helpful to hear from him because he says there's a lot of good things going on that we don't always hear about. We tend to hear all the bad news, but don't hear so much about the good news. So I thought that would be useful to have a discussion about that. And then, yeah, there's still tomorrow morning I can finish up this topic about grief. So yesterday on the table there was a question someone wrote about the bardo, and I left it in my room. Who wrote that question? It was about oh, so could you just summarize it?
Yeah, it's just when you were talking about, grief the other day, and you mentioned the importance of rituals and practices for people who've died. But the teachings also talk about the grief that can be experienced by people when they first, when they're in the bardo and they can hear their relatives who are maybe grieving and feeling all this stuff, and that how important it is to. I just wondered if you'd say a bit more about how important it is that even though we're grieving our loss, that to remember that they can also hear us, and it's important to wish them well and send them on their way.
Where did you hear that?
Pardon?
Where did you hear that?
I've just read it in, I don't know, different books, and also there was a woman, I've forgotten her name, that came to the Abbey to give some teachings. What's her name, Venerable Tuni? Yeah.
Dhammakusha.
Yeah, I transcribed a teaching that she gave at the Abbey a few years ago, and she talked about that a lot, about when beings first die and not to have squabbles in the family and things, even though we're grieving, to sort of wish them well. Was that?
Because I've heard that with regard to before the person dies, like while they are in the process of dying, that it's important to not get into arguments and wail and that kind of thing, because it could disturb the mind of the person while they're dying. But what I understand is what I've heard, and I looked my materials, that once death has happened, that means the consciousness has left the body, it immediately goes into the bardo. And when it's in the bardo, it has the form of the next life. It's already on its way to the next life, the next rebirth, and no longer connected with this body. I even read something, this is in the book Death, Intermediate State, and Rebirth, which is a translation of a Tibetan text. And it says that even when an intermediate state being sees its former physical support, meaning the body, due to the force of having severed any relationship with that body, it does not think my body and does not generate a wish to enter it. So maybe there's different teachings and different traditions about this.
But I think I have read it in, well, yeah.
But regardless, I mean, it probably is good, and also we really don't know when death actually takes place. It's after the breathing stops. So the person might appear dead, and they're not breathing, they're not moving, but the consciousness could still be there in the body. So it's kind of difficult to determine when the consciousness actually does leave the body and enter the bardo. So just to be on the safe side, it is best to try to keep the atmosphere around the person as peaceful as possible and avoid quarreling and wailing and those kinds of things. Is that what you were asking about? Is that what you were worried about?
Yeah, it was just really my understanding that immediately after death, there can be some feelings of grief and fear and all kinds of other things, and that by loved ones, in the same way that they do rituals and practice, being able to keep the mind calm and send that being on their way, it would just be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think that means that people should suppress their sadness. Maybe it's best not to, make sounds and so on in the presence of the body. Go somewhere else to do that. But I mean, it is important if you feel like crying to cry. Maybe you don't have to overdo it and wail and tear out your hair and things like that. But if you feel like crying, let yourself cry, but try to do that in a way that isn't going to disturb other people, or I don't know. Venerable Chuni, do you remember you were here for those teachings?
Actually, this was not a teaching she gave here. This was the teaching she gave at Sakya Monastery.
Oh.
This is a teaching that she gave at Sakya many years ago that I transcribed because of the work that I'm doing. And it's not clear to me, because I asked these questions a little bit to Geshe-la too in my interview with him. it's not clear to me exactly what is Tibetan culture and what is Buddhist teaching in some of these things around death.
Mm.
But I don't think Geshe-la, we didn't even get into the, can people hear you after the,
Mm.
I don't think I asked him about that. I don't think that's in the interview.
I mean, I was kind of quickly reading through that transcript of your interview with Geshe-la, and at one point he did say, yeah, it's kind of natural to feel sad and yeah, like accepting grief is a natural process. We shouldn't suppress it or try not to feel it. That seemed to be what he was saying.
Right. So I'm just skimming through here the transcript that Margaret's talking about, and it looks like what she's saying is immediately after death, the first 3 days before, that there's a possibility of
They
their
might-
of their what's the term of them.
The
Not just that their
consciousness
consciousness
still
might be
in the
there,
body.
but they
Yeah.
also might be able to have some
Yeah.
awareness of what's going on around
So
them.
that's still before death.
Yeah,
before the
the
bardo.
actual. It's not before the clinical death,
Mhm.
but it's before their actual death.
Death
Yeah,
and going
Yeah.
into the bardo.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I think she's talking about.
Yeah. And also I wanted to mention something about this related to this because, there's all these stories, I think, in every culture about ghosts. Somebody has died and then, people see that person or they have dreams about that person and they're talking to them and so on. So this is, another phenomenon, ghosts. And I think people generally believe that that is the actual person who passed away. That's my father. He's in this, in this ghost body and so on. But what I've heard from Tibetan lamas, and I also saw this in the book of Milarepa's songs, is that spirits can impersonate people who've passed away. They can appear in the form of that person and come back and, talk to the relatives. And it's like a trick. And they have clairvoyance. They have the ability to know all about that person and to know about their family. And so they can act like the person who's passed away, but it's not the person who passed away. It's a spirit. Because the teachings on the bardo are that, as soon as the consciousness is separated from this body, it immediately takes this bardo body, which is like a subtle body. It's not like our bodies. And it's kind of like a ghost body. But the form of the bardo body is of the next life, not the previous one. It's not the form of your deceased father. It's, the next life. And as not as a fully grown person, but at the age of 5 or 6 years old, like a little child. So if you see a ghost that looks like your dad or your mom or your dog or whatever who passed away, it's probably this is what the lamas say. I don't know. I'm not in any position to say so, but it's the it's not the real person that you knew. It's a spirit impersonating. So don't believe it. Don't buy into the trick. Does that make sense? I hope that doesn't disappoint anybody. Or maybe it's a relief. If you do have a ghost of your dead husband who's still hanging around, you can say, I know you. You are not Bob. Did you have a question? Where's the microphone over here?
Well, that made me have another question. The spirits, they could maybe have a altruistic motivation maybe for doing that, or it's not always necessarily that they're trying to deceive you.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not in, I can't say what their motivation is. It could be to trick people. get something out of it. But yeah, it could be altruistic as well. Like, oh, this person, they're grieving, they're so sad. If I show up as that person that they missed, that will give them some comfort. It's possible. I don't know. I guess it depends on what kind of interaction there is.
I remember hearing that when you're in the bardo, you actively look for your next parents. So it's like, how would you know immediately, or how would you take the form of that rebirth immediately without having looked?
It's the karma. So you have the, the process of the 12 links. So one of your karmic seeds, we have many karmic seeds in our mind. So one of those gets activated before death by craving and grasping. Then that, is the cause for the next life, the next rebirth. So it's already like before death. That karma has already been activated to either be a human being or a dog or a cow or whatever, or a deva. So yeah, it's activated before death happens. So I don't know if it means when you're in the bardo form, you have this specific form of what you're going to look like, or maybe it's just the general form of a human being or whatever. Because there's also controversy about whether karma can change while you're in the bardo. And there's different positions. Vasubandhu says, no, it cannot be changed. Once you've hit the bardo, then you're going to go to that type of form. Whereas Asanga says it can change. Geshe-la talked about that in the, so Asanga said, and that's why prayers, doing prayers for people who've passed away, especially in that first period of 49 days, creating merit, doing prayers, creating merit, and then dedicating for that person could change that karma. And if they're headed for an unfortunate rebirth, it could change to a fortunate one. Complicated.
I wonder if it's clearer to say it can act as a condition for that karma to change, rather than it changes that karma.
Yeah.
Because it's the person's karma that's making the change.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what happens, but anyway, the possibility of a change, so that if they're headed for an unfortunate realm, unfortunate rebirth, it could change to a fortunate rebirth. And there's this practice they call Jangwa, kind of an elaborate practice, but it can be done for someone who's passed away. And basically what a lama does is kind of invoke the consciousness of the person who's passed away. And then, I don't remember how it goes. I've been present for a few of those, but there's lots of offerings made and so on. And then at the end, there's a teaching given. The Lama gives a teaching to this being who's in the bardo, and then sends them off to a Pure Land, something like that. So it's possible that if a Lama does that ritual, that they could, help someone go to the Pure Land. When I was in Singapore, we had a few lamas do that. One was Demalocha Rinpoche, a really wonderful lama. He came and did that, and he said that he had also been invited to Korea to do this for people who died during the Korean War, which was in the 50s. And I thought, wow. So even long after the bardo, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how effective it is, but even to have a ritual like that done, it could benefit even people who passed away long ago, to, bring them out from where they are and send them to a better place, a better rebirth. Yeah, Tibetans are amazing. just the practices they have, the rituals they do is incredible. Okay, so we'll stop there and dedicate the merit, the positive energy.